Hello fellow history lovers, welcome back to my channel. My name is Philippa Lacey-Bruhl from British History Tours, and this is This Week in British History. And if you love British history, then make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the bell so that you get a notification each week when I upload one of these videos, and bonus videos as well. I have some historian interviews and some virtual tours that will be going up on the channel too. Okay, anyone notice anything different about the background today? Pop it in the comments, let's see if you've been observant. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the first meeting of a representative parliament in England, the beginning of the trial of Charles I, the death of Queen Victoria, who at the time of her death was our longest reigning monarch and in whose reign massive changes happened in the country. It's also the week of the wedding of one of the most famous couples of all time, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and it's also the week in which the first Stuart king was crowned, Robert II of Scotland, who his House of Stuart became the house that united England and Scotland. The first representative parliament held in England was held on the 20th of January 1265. It was led by a man called Simon de Montfort. He was the brother-in-law of the king, King Henry III, and married to the king's sister, Eleanor. Henry and his eldest son, Edward, were being held captive by Simon de Montfort, who was claiming to rule in their name. Henry III was the son of King John of Magna Carta fame. Magna Carta introduced for the first time in England the idea of a representative government and a monarch being held accountable to its people. Where Magna Carta had set out in theory this idea that the king could be held accountable, a later agreement called the Provisions of Oxford actually started to set out the mechanics of how this would work. And just as John had agreed to Magna Carta, so his son Henry III agreed to the Provisions of Oxford. But also, like his father, he ran to the Pope at his earliest opportunity to get out of the promises that he'd made. And again, just as with John, this caused uproar with the barons of the land and unrest, leading to his own brother-in-law Simon de Montfort raising an army from his base at Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire. His army met that of the king's outside Lewes in Sussex on the 12th of May 1264. Despite being outnumbered, de Montfort's army inflicted a crushing defeat on the king's men at the Battle of Lewes, and shortly afterwards took the king and his eldest son Edward prisoner. For the next 15 months, de Montfort ruled the country. But how when he had the king captive? Well, he decided to use Parliament. In response to increasing unrest both within the country and even within his own supporters, de Montfort decided that he needed to call Parliament in order to rule through them and give this, what many considered an unnatural state of affairs, having an anointed king in captivity, some air of legitimacy. Writs were sent out to the sheriffs, the royal representatives in each county, to ask them to send forward 2 law-worthy knights to represent them in the Parliament. Cities were also asked to send 2 citizens, again of law-abiding and worthy persons, to come and represent their area. On the 28th of May 1264, 16 days after the Battle of Lewes, Edward, Henry III's eldest son, was able to escape his prison with the help of Lady Maud de Montfort, who was a loyal royalist. She had arranged for him supplies and horses and shelter, and so he managed to escape and raise an army which met that of Simon de Montfort again, this time in Evesham. On the 4th of August, 6 weeks after Edward's escape, he got his army to Evesham, where it met with de Montfort's army. This time though, for de Montfort, it was going to be a huge defeat. Thousands of his supporters were killed and de Montfort himself was killed. His body was mutilated, and his head and testicles hacked off and sent to Maud by Queen Eleanor as a thank you for her loyalty. I could think of better presents for that. So what was so special about this Parliament? There had been parliaments before, but this is a key one because it's the first time that it was a representative Parliament. It wasn't, however, the first time knights from the shires had attended a Parliament, but when they had in the past, it had been for very specific reasons around taxation and agreement to some sort of taxation. This was the first time that they had been asked to come and just represent their areas and help in decision making of the country. Okay, so we know de Montfort wasn't getting on with his king, Henry III. We know there was a split. This is a time after Magna Carta, within living memory of many of the people alive at the time, that their ideals that they were promised about being represented in the governance of the country, having the king held accountable to the property owners, because they're the only ones that matter, would happen, and it hadn't happened. So de Montfort was in this position where people were willing to try something new, and the mechanics of how this would happen were sort of falling into place. Even though de Montfort, he's credited with having this first representative Parliament, but I don't think we should over-romanticise his intentions around it. It was for a purpose. He needed an air of legitimacy over his rule while he effectively had the king and the heir to the throne in captivity. Although with the death of de Montfort his rule was over, the ideas and the ideals behind Parliament and a representative house lived on and is what we still see as a linchpin of our democracy now. Another event in this week in British history, in fact on the same day as the first representative Parliament had been held in 1265, the 20th of January, in 1649 was the start of the trial of Charles I. And this is another example of where the king is being held accountable to Parliament, but this is much more serious for the king. He is being put on trial effectively for treason. The trial and ultimate execution of Charles I was a hugely significant event in British history, which many people, believe it or not, in Britain don't really know much about. This was the first time that a ruling king had been put on trial by his people, effectively being asked to account for his actions. Charles I, as his father James I, or James VI of Scotland, had believed, he was divinely appointed. He was appointed by God, and so he wasn't answerable to the people. We are almost 400 years past the first representative Parliament, this idea that not only is the king answerable to the country and to his people, but also that they have a say in what goes on, and therefore Parliament must be called. Charles did not see things like that, and this caused huge issues in the country, leading to the English Civil Wars. This trial was royal authority answering to the people. It brings into stark focus the understanding that legitimate authority is there by the consent of the people. The people have to trust in the ruler that they are there to benefit the common good. Charles I was considered to have broken this trust. On the 22nd of January 1371, Robert II was crowned in Scotland. Robert was Robert Stuart, and he is the first monarch of the Stuart dynasty. Robert ruled from 1371 to 1390 as Robert II of Scotland, and it is his house that descended to be the first house to rule over both Scotland and England under his great-great-great-great-great-great grandson, James VI of Scotland, James I of England. The Stuart dynasty lasted 343 years, ending with the death of Queen Anne, who died childless despite 17 pregnancies in August 1714. On the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria dies at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Victoria had overseen 63 years of massive change in this country. In this episode, I want to just cover what the changes, domestic changes, were. We had the introduction of the railways, and railway travel made a massive impact on everyone's lives. Not only did their construction create jobs, but then their maintenance and the running of the railways also created jobs for what would have been the working classes. So this opened up new opportunities. But then also it meant that goods, commodities, food, textiles could be transported quicker and cheaper, which meant that people in the cities, for instance, had access to fresh fish that they could afford. People could travel to the seaside. This is the beginning of people having leisure time. We saw a decrease in the amount of hours that someone had to work in a day or a week, and so they had a bit more leisure time, they had a little bit more money in their pocket, and they had the ability to travel using the railways and some tram systems as well, which came into place. And so this was it was a period of massive change in people's social lives and leisure. We have the first package tour operator created, Thomas Cook. The Thomas Cook package holidays came into being during the Victorian era, and actually Thomas Cook was a viable business until 2019 when it collapsed. As well as better transport links, we saw the introduction of the penny postage. Rowland Hill, who hails from my hometown of Kidderminster, brought in this idea that you paid for the letter before it was sent and a set fee regardless of where it went. Up until then, the receiver of the letter had to pay for its transport, which I always seemed to be a rather strange idea, that you could send a letter to someone and they have to pay for it, so they have actually no control about whether they were going to pay for it. But with the penny postage, it meant that people could send letters, they could communicate with people who were wider than their immediate circle, than their immediate vicinity. People could stay in touch with family members who had moved for work. So it seems such a small thing, and yet it made a massive difference to people's daily lives. There was still a huge divide between the wealthy and the poor of society, but at least life for the poor was getting better. To attribute these changes to Victoria herself would be taking it a step too far. She always managed to maintain a distance from truly understanding the plight of society's most poor, and there was still a big section of society which we would consider living in conditions that we wouldn't expect people to live in today. But her age, her reign, is remembered as one of rapid industrialisation, rapid improvements in technology, and a really exciting time for Britain. On the 25th of January 1533, Henry VIII married his second wife Anne Boleyn at the Palace of Whitehall. The Palace of Whitehall, as Henry and Anne knew it, doesn't exist anymore, so I went over to try and show you where the actual spot is where they got married. Because Whitehall Palace was the biggest, the largest, the most magnificent palace in Europe at the time that it was built, and you can't see very much of it left anymore at all. Now, it was built up from a place called York Place in the area which we now refer to as Whitehall in London. And York Place had been the house of, the home of Cardinal Wolsey. Now, Cardinal Wolsey, Thomas Wolsey, had been the chief minister in Henry VIII's court when Henry VIII came to power. And but he was cardinal, so as in he was also the Pope's representative in England, and he was he became Archbishop of York, which is why he lived at York Place. Now, when Henry VIII wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon after 23 years of marriage in order to marry Anne Boleyn and hopefully have a son, Cardinal Wolsey Henry had expected Wolsey to be able to secure him his divorce. And when Wolsey couldn't, and Henry ended up breaking from Rome and breaking from the Pope's authority, Wolsey's palaces, homes, so we had Hampton Court Palace, York Place, all of his possessions were confiscated. Now, York Place was in fact the property of the church, but this didn't bother Henry. Henry just took it anyway. And he took a fancy to York Place, as did Anne Boleyn, and they decided they were going to build it create it into the most magnificent palace. You've got to remember, Henry was a big builder. He loved architecture. He loved creating things. He would write his own plans for buildings and palaces, and so he designed a lot of it. And so we had this massive sprawling palace, of which we see very little of it left today. I'm in a place called Whitehall Gardens, but we're going to take a walk over. So we're going to have a bit of a walk around now. I'm going to show you try and give you a little bit of an idea of just what kind of space this palace took. So we're going to take a walk now up onto Whitehall and Horse Guards Parade. So when Henry VIII built his Whitehall Palace, he built it in two halves, effectively. The sort of political side, the state side that had his chambers and the court in, and the pleasure side. So Henry was big into his sport. He liked tennis, referred to as real tennis, but that's the word royal, which is sort of been used, and it's changed to real, but it means royal tennis. I always think of it as a bit more like squash. It's an indoor game rather than the outdoor tennis that we see. And he liked jousting and cockfighting as well. So there was a cockpit built on the other side of the palace. So we're coming up now to, you'll recognise Horse Guards Parade, and behind there is the Horse Guards Parade ground, which was the site of Henry's jousting, tilt yard, where they would have jousting, which Henry was a big fan of. He liked to do it himself. He did, though, have a massive accident. I think it was 1536. It's around the time he might have been 35. He'd married Anne Boleyn. She was pregnant. And she miscarried when the story goes that she miscarried when she heard the news that that he'd fallen off his horse in a jousting accident, and he was actually unconscious for 2 hours. So I've come up Horse Guards Avenue, and we're on to the road which is referred to as Whitehall now, but obviously gets its name from Whitehall Palace. I'm going to cross the road so that you can get a better view of this building here. This is the banqueting house, and it's part of Whitehall Palace. It's the last remaining part of Whitehall Palace. It's the Great Hall. The Tudor Great Hall burnt down. Like I said, these palaces obviously being wooden, a lot of timber in them, and their light source and heat source being fire. It was problematic. So I'm waiting for the lights here. So this is banqueting house. Now, around about where you see that statue-ish was somewhere called the Holbein Gate. So that would have linked the part of the palace that would be on the left to the pleasure part of the palace, which would have been over there on the right. Here we go. And the Holbein Gate connected Henry's private apartments to the pleasure side of the palace, and it was where he married Anne Boleyn. So Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn got married somewhere in the thin air up there. And they got married in secret. And they got married in secret for two reasons. One, technically, he was still married to Catherine of Aragon. His divorce hadn't been granted. And the second reason was that Anne was already pregnant with the future Queen Elizabeth I. Thank you for watching this episode of This Week in British History. If you enjoyed it, please do subscribe to the channel, give me a thumbs up and hit the bell so that you get notifications every time I upload a new episode. But if you can't wait that long, please do come over to my Facebook page or Instagram where I do daily posts so you can get a daily hit of history as well.